Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. My name is Joe Houlihan. I run the military history talks here. It's a very special year for us because it's our bicentenary. And we have a number of events going on, including a new exhibition, which is downstairs, and you may have seen it, and you're very welcome to come along and have a look at that anytime. It's free. It's a pleasure to see so many here tonight. We also have, I think, at least 50 or 60 people online, so it's a terrific turnout. Belgrano, which I have to say, even at the time, seemed like a hostage to fate. You may remember BBC's Brian Hanrahan, who deftly sidestepped reporting restrictions on how many Harrier jump jets were on the aircraft carrier, the Hermes, he was sailing with, by saying famously, "I counted them all out and I counted them all back," thus reassuring the anxious public that there had been no casualties. But my most striking memory of all comes from the end of the war. British paratroopers had marched across East Falkland and were closing in on the capital, Port Stanley. They were ordered to halt just short of the town, but there was a journalist with them who decided to keep going. He walked alone into Port Stanley, the first non-Falklands Briton to do so since the Argentine troops had invaded. If that wasn't inspiration for a young journalist, I don't know what is. And that example of being fearless in pursuit of getting the story before anyone else stood me in very good stead when I began my reporting career in the hostile environment of SIDCUP. Anyway, that man was, of course, tonight's speaker, Sir Max Hastings. He went on to have a spectacular journalistic career, including stints as editor of the Daily Telegraph and of the London Evening Standard. He continues to contribute to many leading publications today. He has made documentary films, and of course, he's also very highly regarded and a multi-award-winning historian who's published books on topics including the Falklands War, the Battle for Japan, the Second World War, the Korean War, many, many more. Tonight, he'll be discussing the subject of his recent book, Abyss, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. It's an excellent work, focusing especially on the characters and actions of the three main protagonists, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro. And I think I found particularly helpful his background on all three of them, which helped you understand how they acted the way they did during the crisis. With nuclear brinkmanship being played right now over the Ukraine-Russia war, and who knows, perhaps even over Taiwan in the not-too-distant future, the book's relevance for the times we now inhabit is obvious. So please join me in welcoming Sir Max Hastings.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that extremely kind introduction. I should say that the colonel of 2 Para, with whom I walked into Port Stanley, or just ahead of whom I walked into Port Stanley, said he wished the Argentines had shot me because what I did was so irresponsible. Early on the morning of the 16th of October, 1962, US President John F. Kennedy was presented with secret air reconnaissance photos which revealed that the Soviet Union had deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the US mainland. That revelation triggered the biggest crisis of the Cold War, and indeed the gravest threat thus far to the survival of mankind. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev said afterwards, "We were truly on the verge of war." Kennedy's first words were, "We're probably going to have to bomb them." Then he summoned his brother Bobby, the administration's attorney general, who observed with statesman-like elegance, "Oh, shit, 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 those sons of bitch Russians." America's armed forces prepared to invade Fidel Castro's island. At one of the first top-secret White House conferences that followed the photos, it was agreed that the Russians would probably respond by seizing West Berlin, an Allied enclave amidst communist East Germany. Robert Kennedy demanded, "Then what do we do?" General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, shrugged, "Go to general war if it's in the interests of ours." The president asked, "You mean nuclear exchange?" Taylor assented almost insouciantly. Guess you have to. The audio tapes testify to JFK's shocked disbelief. He said seconds later, now the question really is to what action we take which lessens the chance of a nuclear exchange, which obviously is the final failure. The final failure. The final failure. It's hard to overstate the importance of such language from the president. Jack Kennedy understood, and some others round the cabinet table did not, the supreme gravity of the peril for mankind. When I started out to write my book, the missile crisis seemed like ancient history. Yet today, amid the Russian rape of Ukraine and President Putin's repeated nuclear threats, those events possess a frightening new immediacy. Once again, a reckless gambler occupies the Kremlin. We need to learn from the past how best the West can confront Putin's menaces without precipitating Armageddon. In 1962, the Soviet Union was tottering. Few people in the West realized this, but one man did, Khrushchev. The Kremlin's tenant was bitterly conscious that the capitalists, whom he despised, people who had suffered far less than his own in the so-called Great Patriotic War against the Nazis, were getting richer and richer, while most Russians lived in threadbare poverty. Khrushchev was convinced that socialism was destined to triumph eventually. Meanwhile, however, Americans watched color TV and ate steak, while any Russians, lucky enough to own tiny black and white sets, had to view their screens through water-filled magnifiers, and in some regions, bread was rationed. Their leader, desperate for good news, wanted a coup that would showcase supposed Soviet might. He sought this on the Caribbean island conquered 3 years earlier by his new best friends, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Khrushchev loved to holiday on the Black Sea. Gazing across its waters through binoculars, he was nagged by bitterness that only a few hundred miles away in Turkey were sighted American Jupiter nuclear missiles aimed at Russia. One day in April 1962, he suddenly demanded of his defense minister, Marshal Malinowski, "What if we throw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants?" He had conceived a grandstand play, secretly to ship into Cuba ballistic missiles capable of destroying half the United States, and then to stun the world with an announcement of them. The Kremlin Presidium rubber-stamped this proposal. Nobody questioned the Soviet general's crazy claim that the missiles could be hidden from American reconnaissance planes under palm trees. Khrushchev promised his comrades that Cuba could thus be protected from threatened invasion, and that the 17-to-1 US superiority in nuclear warheads could be tilted against the capitalists. Of course, the Americans wouldn't like this, but they would have to lump it. Legally, the Cubans were as much entitled to host Soviet nuclear weapons as the Turks, Italians, and British were American ones. And yet, inevitably, when the sensation was revealed to the White House, the Americans responded with outrage, not least about the barrage of lies behind which the Russians acted, directly comparable with their more recent rhetoric. In the days before Kennedy revealed his secret knowledge to the world, his armed forces chiefs demanded a violent response. Above all, the Air Force's General Curtis LeMay, a monster straight from the cast of the classic nuclear horror movie, Dr. Strangelove. LeMay challenged his president, saying, "We won't have any choice except direct military action." if the US attempted a mere blockade of Cuba, the first thing that's going to happen is your missiles are going to disappear into the woods. This is almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. We're just going to gradually drift into a war under conditions that are at great disadvantage to us. LeMay then used language that was both impertinent and malicious. The president, said the airman, had promised the American people action against offensive weapons. I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered a pretty weak response. You're in a pretty bad fix. The president, astounded by LeMay's barrage of insults, demanded, "What did you say?" The general doubled down. "You're in a pretty bad fix." Kennedy, with disarming humor, batted back at the air chief. "You're in there in it with me." There was a flicker of uneasy laughter from the table before JFK added an emphasis. "Personally." In the first week of the crisis, before Kennedy went public, he came under enormous pressure as the chiefs of staff delivered a unanimous recommendation for a surprise air and amphibious assault, which would, of course, kill thousands of Russians as well as Cubans. It's chilling today to read in the archives later testimony by those same American generals asserting their impenitence for having urged war, their enduring conviction that the US could have secured a, quote, decisive victory over the Russians, their contempt for the president who, quote, chickened out. Kennedy later told the economist J.K. Galbraith, "Ken, you will never know how much bad advice I received." US Marines chanted as they trained, "Where we gonna go? Gonna go to Cuba. What we gonna do? Gonna castrate Castro." What the Americans then had no inkling of was that in addition to the ballistic missiles in Cuba, the Russians had also deployed scores of tactical nuclear weapons together with 43,000 troops. If US forces had attacked, whatever the contrary views of the Kremlin, it seems to me unlikely that the Russians on the ground would have accepted punishing losses and probable defeat without unleashing some of this deadly arsenal. Escalation would have been almost inevitable. The 1962 White House exuded an aura of power unrivaled by any other center of government in the world, and indeed unmatched by today's US presidency. Kennedy himself was a child of privilege who introduced into his administration energy, wit, and culture. Resident historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote euphorically, "Never had girls seemed so pretty, tunes so melodious, and evenings so blithe and unconstrained." Though the president knew nothing of the bullets approaching him from the Dallas book depository, he was always in a hurry. Yet there was a profound tension between his outward appearance of vigor and beauty and an inner reality of frailty and pain. He inherited from his near gangster father ruthlessness and lack of sentiment, while some of his finest rhetoric addressed the plight of less fortunate humanity. His actions showed little concern for it. There was a coldness manifested in passionless sexual couplings. One of his teenage lovers, Mimi Beardsley, plausibly recorded that he never kissed her on the lips. In the words of one intimate, "He was nice to people, but heedless of people." Yet the missile crisis proved Kennedy's finest hour. On Saturday, the 20th of October, 1962, after days and nights of fierce argument, he determined to defy many of his own advisors. America would not immediately resort to shooting. Instead, he decreed that on the Monday, 2 days later, he would reveal the missiles to the world, and the US Navy would impose a blockade on Cuba. After Kennedy read Terence Sorensen's draft of his intended words to the nation, he turned to the two aides with him. We are very, very close to war. Yet then his sense of black humor broke through. And there is not room in the White House shelter for all of us. At 7 p.m. on Monday, the 22nd of October, US TV programming was canceled to make way for the president's statement from the Oval Office. Kennedy delivered words that echoed round the world. He announced his blockade and stated that the US would regard any nuclear weapon launched from Cuba as representing an attack, quote, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. From the moment Kennedy broadcast, Nikita Khrushchev knew himself in deep trouble. He told the Kremlin Politburo, "We do not want to unleash a war. We simply want to frighten and restrain the USA in the matter of Cuba." But the Soviet commander on the island placed his forces on full alert. Marshal Malinovsky proposed to dispatch an order, "All means of defense should be in a state of readiness." Khrushchev belatedly grasped the chasm this would open. If Soviet forces on the island were to use all means without exception, he told Malinovsky, that would include the missiles. Doesn't that mean the start of a thermonuclear war? How can we imagine such a thing? He and most of his colleagues in those dark hours inside the Kremlin were suddenly frightened men, probably as frightened as they'd ever been in lives richly endowed with terror. Despite Khrushchev's private realization that he would have to back off, for almost a week, he kept the world trapped in terror by broadcasting defiance and new threats. The mood of that time in the West isn't easy to recapture. There was an instinctive disbelief in annihilation amid commonplaces that were all around us. I myself was a teenage schoolboy preoccupied with getting out of football. The historian Peter Hennessy has written wittily of his horror on discovering that the Soviet Union had earmarked 5 nuclear megatons for Liverpool. Had these been unleashed in 1962, Hennessy observed, before the imminent dawning of the Beatles and Liverpool Sound, whatever posterity was left after the city's vaporization might have supposed that Cliff Richard represented the creative pinnacle of British pop music. Graham Perry was a 17-year-old grammar school sixth former in Kent. He and his fellow pupils, waiting for their maths teacher to arrive for a lesson, discussed the crisis. A very pretty girl named Gillian, and remember, these were still pretty virginal teenage times, explained how, if doom beckoned, she and her friends proposed to spend their last moments on Earth with a clutch of fortunate boys. Then she added, "You know, if there's one of these 4-minute warnings, and then it turns out to have been a false alarm, some of us girls are going to look pretty stupid." The subsequent history of the missile crisis is that of the Soviet Union writhing and twisting to extricate itself without humiliation. And all the while, nuclear disaster could have happened through accident or miscalculation. There were episodes such as that involving a Russian submarine 600 miles out in the Atlantic. Its captain, uncertain whether on the surface war had broken out, allegedly threatened to fire his nuclear torpedo when harassed by US warships. Junior officers had discretion over the use of weapons of mass destruction, which could have unleashed a catastrophe wholly unintended by either the Kremlin or the White House. In Britain, opinion was deeply divided. Many people, including privately Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, thought nothing at stake in Cuba was worth a nuclear war. In the days following Kennedy's broadcast, in many capitals, demonstrations against the US mustered thousands of noisy people. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, observed ruefully at the White House, "The mobs that we stimulated turned up in London instead of Havana. Bertrand Russell's C&D people stormed the embassy there." The Guardian editorialized, "If Khrushchev has really brought in nuclear missiles, he's done so to demonstrate to the US and the world the meaning of American bases close to the Soviet frontier. The paper's conditional was significant. Millions of people were initially unwilling to accept the narrative of a US president. The Times likewise suggested that given the excesses of earlier American behavior towards Cuba, the British people were entitled to be, quote, extremely wary about Washington's account. The Times editorial concluded, it's of the utmost importance that American objectives remain limited. They are not to topple Castro or defeat communism. Another Times editorial acknowledged that whatever happened to the Soviet missiles in Cuba, the American ones in Turkey should go. The biggest British beneficiaries of the crisis were the makers of the first James Bond film, Dr. No, which had opened in London 2 weeks earlier to poor reviews and box office takings. Ian Fleming's fantastic tale of a Chinese millionaire rocket fancier in the Caribbean on the payroll of Moscow suddenly seemed topical. The film became hugely popular and profitable. At 10 a.m. on the 24th of October, the USAF Strategic Air Command was summoned to DEFCON 2, an alert status just one step short of war. Sacks, bombers, and crews were primed to strike in a fashion terrifyingly close to the Strangelove movie. Regional commanders possessed authority to launch their nuclear weapons without orders from Washington if they had evidence that war had started. It was extraordinary to have mandated such unstable figures as LeMay to precipitate Armageddon. Khrushchev raged at Kennedy. He knew that he himself was in deep trouble, but he was still blustering. An American tycoon visiting Moscow was summoned to the Kremlin on the 24th to face a tirade from its master, who told his guest, I'm not interested in the destruction of the world, but if you want us all to meet you in hell, it's up to you. Meanwhile, at the White House, news was constantly arriving, hours behind reality at sea, about the progress of Soviet ships approaching the blockade line and thus a possible shootout. When the president authorized warships to drop practice depth charges to force a Soviet submarine to surface, Robert Kennedy wrote, I think those few minutes were the time of gravest concern for the president. Was the world on the brink of a Holocaust? Was it our error? Was there something further that should have been done or not done? His hand went up to his face and covered his mouth. He opened and closed his fists. His face seemed drawn, his eyes pained, almost gray. We stared at each other across the table. For a few fleeting seconds, it was almost as though no one else was there, and he was no longer the president. Then, in mid-meeting, a message was passed to CIA boss John McCone, who made a momentous announcement. Mr. President, we have a preliminary report which seems to indicate that some of the Russian ships have stopped dead in the water. 7 minutes later, a second confirmatory message reached McCone. Dean Rusk said, it looks like the other fellow just blinked. And so, of course, Khrushchev had. That evening, Kennedy spoke with Harold Macmillan. The president asked, recorded the prime minister, straight out the $64,000 question, should he take out Cuba? Macmillan wrote in his diary, I said I would like to think about this. It's just like a review called Beyond the Fringe, which takes off the leading politicians. Labour MP John Strachey wrote later, Mr. Macmillan's public pronouncements and what one heard about his private reactions sounded to me rather like those of a fussy old retired nanny forever calling out, oh, Master Jack, do be careful or the bad men will get you. The Economist magazine feared that Washington was driving Moscow into a corner. It wrote of, quote, the ominous possibility that the blockade does not mark the end of American plans for action against Dr. Castro's land. Macmillan now messaged Kennedy urging him to call off his blockade if the Russians would accept UN inspection of the Cuban missile sites and negotiate. This reflected a caution for which conservative Americans, especially uniformed ones, despised the Brits. They considered that the attitude of many of Macmillan's people reflected an unworthy fear of the communists, symbolized by the disarmers slogan, "Better red than dead." In Washington, the 27th of October later became known as Black Saturday because Armageddon seemed imminent. Khrushchev had sent a succession of confused but still defiant messages. He seemed stubbornly unwilling to remove his missiles. Cuban troops began firing at overhead American planes. A U-2 aircraft that had taken off on a routine mission from Alaska got lost and plunged 300 miles into Russian airspace, where MiGs were ordered to intercept it, and the Americans also scrambled fighters armed with nuclear-tipped missiles to protect their own plane. Only after 10 hours of suspense did the stray U-2 mercifully land back in Alaska after the pursuing Soviets failed to catch it. Meanwhile, over the Arctic, a Soviet bomber staged a nuclear test explosion, and on Saturday morning, a US bomber detonated a stupendous catch-up blast over the Pacific. Gravest of all, from Cuba, a Soviet anti-aircraft missile crew fired a salvo at an American U-2 75,000 feet above. Moscow had hours earlier told its commanders to prepare to withdraw their missiles. But in the chaos that seems to attend all Russian military operations now, as then, frustrated local commanders in Cuba, who had had enough of the Americans, fired anyway. The U-2 disintegrated. Its dead pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, fell into a cane field a few miles from Barnes, where in 1949, Fidel Castro had celebrated his first wedding at the local American club. Only hours later did Kennedy and his advisors at the White House hear this news, which seemed to show a Soviet commitment to escalate. Somebody at the White House table said grimly, "They fired the first shot." More were expected to follow. In London, Defense Minister Peter Thorneycroft recalled seeing Whitehall deserted and silent that weekend. Rather a lovely morning, and just thinking, my God, I wonder whether this really is it. Finally, again defying his military brass, Jack Kennedy said on that Saturday, "We won't attack tomorrow. We shall try again." It seems to me that those words would have represented no contemptible epitaph. He dispatched another letter to Khrushchev, saying that in return for withdrawal of the missiles from Cuba, the US would formally undertake to mount no further military operations against the island. His brother Bobby drove to deliver a copy personally to the Soviet ambassador. Bobby warned Anatoly Dobrynin that time was running short before the US took military action. But he also offered a private undertaking that if the missiles went home, the US would, within months, remove its own Jupiters from Turkey. Robert Kennedy later recalled his own words to the Russian. "We had to have a commitment by at least tomorrow that those bases would be removed. This was not an ultimatum," I said, "but just a statement of fact. If they did not remove those bases, we would." The president, meanwhile, sat down to watch a screening of Roman Holiday with Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn. Earlier that evening, an aide had taken advantage of Jackie Kennedy's overnight absence to smuggle into the White House mansion Mimi Beardsley, an intern in the press office. Her inability to type was no handicap in her real role as one of the president's lovers. Although she allegedly chatted to Kennedy that evening, she found him understandably preoccupied and no sexual encounter took place. Even the relentlessly priapic president had too much else on his mind. The 19-year-old, according to her own account, slept in the next room while the two men watched their movie. In Moscow, it was already late morning on Sunday the 28th when Khrushchev summoned the Presidium to an emergency meeting to discuss Kennedy's letter. His foreign policy advisor wrote later, "The First Secretary was keenly aware, as were all of us, that in the situation that had arisen, when nerves on both sides were strained to breaking point, a single spark might cause an explosion." Khrushchev told the comrades, "We find ourselves face to face with the threat of war and nuclear catastrophe, as a result of which human civilization may perish. To save humanity, we should retreat. I have called you all together to consider whether you agree with such a decision." The whole meeting recognized the urgency in the light of reports that an American assault was imminent. Khrushchev emphasized that once the offered deal was struck, Castro would be safe because the US would pursue no further military operations against Cuba. Nobody around the table viewed this as a great Soviet victory, however, since he also admitted that the USSR's ballistic missiles would be brought home. When the chairman sat down, only Mikoyan and Gromyko spoke. In the words of another participant, the others preferred to remain silent, as if giving the president to understand, "It was you who got us into this mess. Now get yourself out of it." Although some of the comrades privately seethed towards Khrushchev, all bowed to the inevitability of surrender. Moreover, even as they talked, Khrushchev received an emotional letter cabled from Fidel Castro, appearing to urge that if the Americans invaded his island, the Soviet Union should deliver a nuclear-first strike against the US. The Soviet leader said later, "We were completely aghast. Only a person who has no idea what thermonuclear war means, or who has been so blinded like Castro by revolutionary passion, can talk like that." The Presidium was now convinced that it had only hours before the Americans attacked, while its Cuban client was talking like a madman. Khrushchev decided that the USSR's surrender had become so urgent that instead of dispatching a ciphered cable response to Washington, his agreement to remove the missiles should be publicly broadcast at 5 p.m., mid-Sunday morning, Washington time. Moscow radio was alerted. Yuri Levitan, its most famous announcer, was summoned from home to read the text over the air. Yet when speed might be a matter of mankind's life and death, the black Chaika limousine carrying Khrushchev's message first lost its way and then became delayed by traffic. When the hapless apparatchik finally dashed into the radio building and entered the lift, this juddered to a halt between floors. This being a Sunday, no engineer was on duty. Only after several minutes of blind, trapped panic did the lift suddenly and inexplicably judder into life again, delivering the messenger to the studio. Levitan, whose deep voice had made him Stalin's favorite mouthpiece, delivered his historic broadcast. In Washington, Kennedy and his civilian advisors succumbed to relief and rejoicing. At the Pentagon, however, the US chiefs of staff refused to believe a word of it. They messaged the president, "The JCS interpret the Khrushchev statement to be an effort to delay direct action by the United States while preparing for diplomatic blackmail." The chiefs asked Kennedy to order airstrikes against Cuba the next day, to be followed by invasion. Curtis LeMay did not hide his rage that the USAF's beautiful bombing plan had suddenly become redundant. Navy Chief Admiral George Anderson's reaction was, "We have been had." This caused the president to say wearily, "The military are mad." A sense of anticlimax, however welcome, overtook Harold Macmillan's room in London. He said to the little cluster of intimates who lingered after his ministers had gone home, "It's like a wedding where there's nothing left to do but drink the champagne and go to sleep." In New York, veteran CBS News correspondent Charles Collingwood told tens of millions of Americans, "This is the day we have every reason to believe the world came out from under the most terrible threat of nuclear holocaust since World War II." Our gratitude today for Kennedy's handling of the missile crisis must be increased by recognizing that less than half his successors as America's commander-in-chief could have been relied upon to make the same cautious calls. Almost from the outset, Kennedy determined to strike a bargain with the Soviets rather than attempt to bludgeon them into submission. He expected to pay a price in order to secure peacefully his unwavering objective, removal of the missiles. The optimism about global peace that swept the West in 1991 and lasted through the first post-Cold War decades today appears naive. A return to great power competition has become a defining feature of the 2020s. Russia's only significant exports are oil, gas, and extreme violence. Yet these enable President Putin to wield astonishing clout for unflaggingly malign purposes. He exercises more personal authority than did First Secretary Khrushchev. Meanwhile, the institutions of the United States find themselves under siege from within by forces, some of which must be described as neo-fascist, in a fashion that America's 1962 leaders would find incomprehensible and terrifying. My book makes many criticisms of American Cold War behavior, especially towards Cuba. Yet nobody should lose sight of a fundamental. The US then led forces that aspired to advance human freedoms, which the Soviet Union opposed. Good and evil are always relative. All of us who inhabit democracies have cause to be grateful that the US prevented the communist superpowers from securing victory, even if the outcome has proved less than the comprehensive triumph for democracy, which such daydreamers as Francis Fukuyama hailed 30 years ago. The most important fact of the Cold War is that the world survived it. This reflected a collective sanity on both sides that transcended the misjudgments of both the Kremlin and the White House. The sum of their statesmanship was greater than its parts. Among some of today's Western leaders and military commanders, a nostalgia is discernible, such as then would have seemed unimaginable for that area's adversarial certainties. International order and stability are now banished, perhaps forever. Khrushchev showed himself a more rational and measured Russian leader than is Putin. What is happening today is not a replay of the old Cold War. That may well represent the start of a new one. 60 years ago, even the Kremlin's hawks recognized that in a nuclear showdown, there could be only one winner, if such a word can be used even pejoratively, which would not be the USSR. This knowledge had a decisive impact on Soviet decisions. Today, by contrast, both China and Russia wield terrifying nuclear power to destroy us all, whatever the limitations of their conventional forces. Putin's willingness to take huge risks and initiate hideous atrocities in pursuit of a fan-Slav fantasy is increased by his consciousness of China's giant progress, of America's continuing technological mastery alongside Russia's relative stagnation. His view of history is skewed by a mingling of ignorance, amorality, and nationalism, blended with his country's long-cherished narrative of grievance and victimhood. His conduct towards Ukraine is less defensible, both morally and legally, than was Khrushchev's in Cuba. It's a theme of my book that those who today dismiss the perils of the missile crisis because neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted nuclear war are mistaken. In 1962, the world got lucky. Our hopes for averting future catastrophe must rely upon 21st century national leaders never for a moment losing sight of the enormity of the danger posed by the weapons at their command. If any fragment of good has emerged from the huge evil of the invasion of Ukraine, it's been to awaken oversleeping Westerners to the importance of security, which requires both political will and military capability. In 1962, the US administration could not have achieved a tolerable outcome of the missile crisis without being known by Moscow to possess the means and to be believed also to have the will to unleash overwhelming force in support of its diplomacy. A rightful motto for every national leader, now as then, is be afraid. Neither John F. Kennedy nor Nikita Khrushchev was deficient in personal courage, but what distinguished them from Fidel Castro and some military commanders on both sides is that the two were alike prudently haunted by consequences. The principal imperative for our planet's prospect of surviving the 21st century beyond confronting climate change is that no national leader shows themselves deficient in the fear which must lie at the heart of wisdom and which was indispensable to a peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you all very much. Right, well, I'm very happy to try and answer some questions, but do shout like mad because I'm terribly deaf.
And you're very welcome to suggest questions from the floor. Dasha here will be taking the microphone around. For all our sakes, if you could speak, have your lips very close to the microphone head, that will help. And it's particularly helpful for the people watching online, otherwise they won't hear your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. Vladimir Putin has opined on many aspects of Russian and Soviet history. Is he known to have given a view on the Cuban Missile Crisis and how perhaps the Soviet Union might have handled it differently?
How the Soviet Union might have handled it differently. There's one very simple point, and that is, if the Soviets had announced that they were deploying the missiles, it would have put the Americans in a much more difficult spot because legally, there was no reason why Cuba, a sovereign country, should not allow the Russians to install missiles. Where the Soviet Union got off on completely the wrong foot was by attempting to hide the deployment of the missiles and by concealing the deployment behind a barrage of lies. And it was the fact that the Russians had been seen to lie again and again and again that put them in such a bad place from the beginning diplomatically. But if they'd announced it, they could have put the Americans in a much tougher spot.
I think the questioner was also asking, has Putin ever commented on the conduct of Cuba?
That I don't think he has, but I don't think, I mean, Putin is a much lonelier figure than Khrushchev was. Khrushchev was answerable for a presidium around the Kremlin table, and Putin is not, and this is what is so scary. And I think we all have cause to be extremely nervous that Putin is capable of a degree of recklessness that Khrushchev was not. And of course, the other thing is, in 1962, as I've just said at the end of my talk, the Russians knew that the West was very well placed, both in nuclear weapons and even in conventional forces to defend itself. Today, we are not. And this is what's so terrifying, and I find it almost beyond belief. Never mind the the Republicans in the United States denying aid to Ukraine. The fact that we are almost disarmed. And one thing I think is very important to remember is that for all the noisy rhetoric from successive British prime ministers about Ukraine, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, and now Rishi Sunak, the first two especially, seeking to profit from associating themselves to Ukraine, only one order for shells has been placed by any prime minister, and that's by Rishi Sunak, since the crisis began, that the British Army's lockers have been stripped bare, and yet absolutely nothing has been done to translate all those fine words into deeds. And our European partners have behaved no better. But if Putin wins this war, which is possible, then it will be gravely our fault, because we failed to support the Ukrainians in the fashion that we proclaimed that we wanted to do.
Thank you for a great talk. I wondered how important you think it was that the leaders in the Cuban Missile Crisis had an active experience of what a horrible war looks like versus situation today, which is very much of leaders that quite often are still fighting imaginary wars of whatever their national psyche is.
I think it was very important, and I mean, I've had some extraordinary letters from the United States since my book was published over there, saying, how can you speak well of Kennedy when he behaved so appallingly to women? And I said, I'm terribly sorry, but I only write about international affairs, and irrespective of how he behaved towards women, the fact remains we were incredibly lucky to have a man who knew so much about the world in the White House at that stage. And there's been nobody quite like him since. And today, I mean, those of us who know the United States pretty well, it is scary how completely, it's not that they hate us, they're just completely uninterested in us, in what happens outside that continent. And this is very scary. And what that whole generation, first of all, when you look at the people around the White House table, and I say we've got the audio tapes, the whole crisis, so we know what everybody said. And sure, some of the generals said very stupid things, but most of the people around that table during that crisis were very smart people who knew a lot about the world. That is no longer true. That the quality of people at the center of government has declined greatly, and they know far less about the world. So yes, what you said about their experience of World War II, and especially Jack Kennedy's, is very important. He had lived in Europe before the Second World War, when his father was a disastrous ambassador in London, but he'd learned a huge amount. He had a lot of friends over here. And I don't think any American president since Kennedy has given a damn what the British thought about anything.
Just following on from that, we have a question from someone in the online audience who says, how nervous would you feel if either Biden or Trump were faced with the sort of decisions that Jack Kennedy was faced with?
I think one must say, very nervous indeed. That democracy is not functioning very well, and it's a tragedy for us all that we have this situation. That I'm roughly the same age as Biden, and I like to think I'm not completely moribund, but I do know I'm not smart enough. I keep forgetting people's names. I am not fit to be the president of anything, and Biden is visibly even less fit than I am to be the president of anything.
I think we give you the job, Max.
The Trump horror story. Various optimistic American friends of mine keep telling me by email almost daily, it's not over yet. Trump may not get it. But we're living in this peculiar world, and I've just been writing a column for Bloomberg about it. All over the world, we see electorates who are unhappy about the way democracy is wanting, pleading for strong men. They want strong people in charge. Now, the big lie that all strong men, whether in the 1930s or today, tell, they say they have solutions to things. Well, they don't. That all the glib solutions that they offer, that everybody who's grown up, what we've all been expensively educated over many years to learn, is that difficult problems don't have solutions. You can only manage them. And anybody who offers solutions is a quack. And Donald Trump is a super quack. But there are enough people who want quack remedies out there that he may yet get elected. So yes, I think there are good reasons to be very, very scared about the choice Americans face, because it's a pretty tough one and not great for the world.
Yeah, I think we can all echo that. Dasha down the back. Oh, we've got, sorry, question at the front. Come to you next.
Fine. Okay. Me? Yes.
Yeah.
Just going to say that you said that Kennedy understood at a very early stage of the Cuban crisis that he had to give something away in order to resolve the situation peacefully. Do you see that as the way that Ukraine ends, or is it impossible to say?
It's a much tougher call, because it's very hard to see what either President Zelensky or the West can give away that doesn't grant a success to because Putin has achieved a fait accompli by seizing eastern Ukraine, and to concede that to him is Trump would concede it tomorrow, but to concede that is a very hard thing. I think one other thing that's very important in the comparison with those times and these, both Jack Kennedy and Bobby said several times after the missile crisis that if they'd had to make the decision at the beginning, the day or two after they saw the photographs, they would have made a worse call than they did after thinking about it for a week. And this is terribly important. They would almost certainly have allowed the chiefs of staff to stampede them into taking armed action, which would have been disastrous. But the question I'm often asked, and I think we can all be sure of the answer, could you today, with a similar crisis, keep that secret for a week? And I don't think it'd be doable in the age of mobile phones and social media. And this is the trouble. I'm a passionate believer in secret diplomacy and in the best decisions being arrived after everybody's being able to talk about them without having to tell the world what they're saying to each other. But this is not the mood of the moment. The mood of the moment is for revelation. And if you have to make decisions of this magnitude in front of a rolling news schedule, it's not very likely that very good decisions are going to come out of it.
A question is why did why did Khrushchev think he'd get away with it in the first place? Was it the Bay of Pigs, or did he see Kennedy as being weak? Why did Khrushchev think he'd get away with putting missiles on there in the first place?
You're absolutely right. He did see, Khrushchev saw Kennedy as being a weak man whom he could bully. And as soon as Kennedy stood up to him, like most bullies, he was desperate to find a way of getting out of it. But in the beginning, because he'd taken part in this aborted summit in Vienna a few months before, in which he'd been able to run Kennedy around the houses and shout at him, and Kennedy had appeared completely baffled because Kennedy had never dealt with anybody like Khrushchev. And Khrushchev had a completely false impression of what he'd get away with. And when he discovered the Americans were not going to roll over, he was stuck. But it was extraordinary when one looks back. What could have possessed Khrushchev to think that he could conceal when this was 90 miles from the American mainland and with American reconnaissance aircraft in constant motion? And this idea, I'm not being funny about the palm trees. The generals really did say they could hide these missiles under palm trees. Well, you've got to be pretty balmy to believe that.
Another question from the online chat. Do you think there were women in the president's life? That's not the question, it does continue. Do you think there were women in the president's life who had valuable connections which helped him be informed to make his good decisions? Well, and I guess were there women, whispering in his ear saying, don't kill the world?
In those days, I'm afraid that, and undoubtedly the world was the worse for it, women had almost no say in anything in the major powers. There was one very important woman who was in the photo interpretation branch of the CIA, and I've written about her in the book. But generally speaking, women were completely excluded from the decision-making process.
Any more questions in the room? Because I have some more.
Sir Max, do you think the tension in the South China Sea between the US and China is another example of brinkmanship that could go horribly wrong quite quickly, whilst we're all focused on Putin?
Do you think the tension in the South China Sea could go horribly wrong very quickly?
I don't think anybody in the White House or in Beijing has the faintest clue how things are going to play out. It's always this business of miscalculations. But the scary part is that the Chinese are creating the most powerful navy the world has ever seen. And the temptation to use it must be very great at some stage. And it's very scary. And a lot of commentators in the United States, whom I respect, believe that it is really possible that there could be a nuclear showdown over Taiwan. I don't know, none of us know, because obviously everything depends on who's in the White House and when it happens. But it's very scary. But this business at the moment, one thing I suppose we have to be grateful for is these strong men around the world, with the exception of Putin, but most of the other strong men, including Trump, they don't, unlike Hitler and Mussolini, they don't seem to have any passion for war for its own sake. But we don't know about Xi. If he's spending these countless billions creating this enormous fleet, and the American Navy within a few years is going to be very, very vulnerable. And I read a lot of stuff every day about how vulnerable the US Navy in the Pacific and the South China Sea can be to Chinese hypersonic weapons and to weapons that can disable their electronic system and the carriers and so on and so forth. So it is a very scary world. I think the only thing we have to, we mustn't despair. First of all, Churchill's great mantra, never despair, is a good one for all ages. But secondly, I've got a letter. I was born on December the 28th, 1945. And 2 or 3 days after I was born, my father wrote me a long letter about the world as he then saw it. And he thought that our lives would be completely cursed and overshadowed by nuclear weapons. And really what's remarkable is that we have managed to live under this nuclear shadow all our lifetimes without thus far anything ghastly happen. So the worst outcomes are not inevitable. So we mustn't despair. But on the other hand, as I said at the end, we have to hope that Putin and Xi are as fearful as they should be of what they might unleash, because the only certainty is that once anybody starts using nuclear weapons, that's finished.
Okay, a question from Duncan on the Zoom chat, then we'll come to a lady on the end over there. Do local commanders in any force currently have local authority to use nuclear weapons, as you were saying was available then, i.e. fully central authority is not required to fire them?
Today, we're told, I hope accurately, that there are far more controls on local control of nuclear weapons than there were then. But what we do know is that then there were no technological controls to prevent local commanders in Cuba, or for that matter, in the submarines from using those weapons, even without say-so from Moscow. But we're told today, and I'm not enough an expert to know, that there are far more checks, even in Russia, on unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, one's also told, in those days, one of the things I mentioned in my book, the Minuteman missile, which was then at the heart of the American deterrent, that it was at still a relatively early stage of development. And in quite a lot of missile silos, the crews had short-circuited the launch procedure in order to be able to launch faster if they got the word. Well, who is to know today whether something similar might be going on? I don't know, and I doubt if you do. But we have to hope for the best.
Yeah, human error is always a dangerous proposition. Did you have a question on the end? Yeah.
I was just curious what made LeMay and the other military men so jingoistic and put such a dangerous situation if Kennedy had listened to them.
Why were Curtis LeMay and some of the other military leaders so jingoistic?
One has to remember.
Yeah, so I was going to say, because presumably they went through the Second World War.
It was the influence of the Second World War. What one has to remember about that generation of American leaders, they had emerged in 1945 victorious. They'd achieved absolute victory, and they had a victory complex for the rest of their lives. And they were very angry in Korea. The Korea ended in a stalemate, in a compromise. And the American generals again thought in 1953 that the politicians had let them down when they should have had victory. Now, what they didn't know is that the whole history of war is that the Second World War was the exception, that the Second World War, in which the Allies achieved absolutely unquestionable, absolute victory over the other side, that was the joker in the pack of wars of history, that most wars of history don't end well. And actually the other thing, I was reading an essay by an American historian the other day, rather a good one, saying that it is very seldom that even the people who start wars get what they hope they're going to get out of it at the end of it. And what is amazing is they don't read in history, so that people like Putin don't seem to know that. Nobody's told him.
I think we've probably got time for, is there a last question in the room? Yeah. Gentleman towards the back.
If the Americans give up in Europe, will there be more nuclear powers in Europe, starting with Poland? And if they give up on the Pacific, will there be more nuclear powers in the Pacific, starting with Japan?
It's a very difficult call. I think what we have to do, one of the lessons, I'm a passionate believer in diplomacy, whether with friends or foes. And one of the worst things that modern governments have done, not only in Britain, where the rundown of the Foreign Office, but also in the United States, with the rundown of the State Department, is you don't have anything like the quality of the diplomats you had then. I'm absolutely awed by the quality of the diplomats who advised Kennedy during the missile crisis, who've been ambassadors in Moscow, and their grasp of the Russians, their understanding of how they thought, was terribly important. And I think in this situation, one of the things that's going to be toughest, especially if we get a Trump presidency, we have to, however difficult it is, keep talking to them and try to keep them engaged. Because my hero among historians, Michael Howard, what I call the good Michael Howard the academic, not Michael Howard the politician, Michael Howard always used to say to me, and I remember him saying 15 or 20 years ago, he said, we must always remember that if anything important is going to get done in the world, the Americans have got to be there. And he was right. But we may have to learn how to manage without the Americans. But what I don't think we should do is just walk off in a huff from anything, whether it's, we can't do much ourselves in the Pacific, but we have to keep talking, and we have to try and keep both our friendship and our confrontations we have to keep engagement, and even with the enemy. I remember a general, a friend of mine, saying to me 3 or 4 years ago, he said he found it very scary that nowadays the West had less routine dialogue with the Russians than we did in the worst days of the Cold War. And I think that's a big mistake. I think you have to keep talking to both your friends and your enemies if you want to avoid the worst.
Well, I'm very sorry to say we've run out of time. I think you probably agree with me. We could carry on listening to Max for a lot longer, but sadly we do have to close up the building at some point. So first of all, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to Sir Max for a terrific and really enlightening talk and so relevant to what's going on in the world today. Please join me in showing our appreciation one last time.